In the year 1899, a school portrait was taken in a small town in rural Pennsylvania. The photograph shows 23 children arranged in 3 neat rows, their faces pale and serious beneath the harsh light of early photography. The girls wear high-collared dresses with lace trim. The boys are dressed in wool jackets and stiff shirts that seem too large for their narrow shoulders. Behind them stands a brick schoolhouse with tall windows that look out onto fields of wheat. The teacher, a stern woman in her 40s, stands to the left with her hands folded at her waist. Everything about this image appears ordinary, a standard document of education and childhood in the final year of the 19th century. For over 120 years, this photograph sat in a local historical society archive, filed among hundreds of similar images from the same era. It was scanned, catalogued, and occasionally viewed by researchers interested in Victorian-era education or clothing styles. No one thought to look closer. No one had reason to question what they were seeing. But photographs have a strange quality. They capture more than the photographer intends. They freeze moments that the human eye might miss, details that only reveal themselves when time has passed and context has shifted. This particular photograph held something that went unnoticed for more than a century, something that would eventually transform it from a simple school portrait into evidence of a truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. The boy sits in the second row, fourth from the left. His hair is dark and parted severely to one side. His jacket is buttoned all the way to his collar. His hands rest on his knees, fingers splayed in a way that suggests rigidity rather than relaxation. At first glance, he looks like any other child in the photograph, another young face frozen in the uncomfortable stillness that early cameras demanded. But there is something in his expression that separates him from the others. The children around him show the typical discomfort of long exposure times, the slight blur of suppressed movement, the neutral masks that people wore when sitting for photographs required minutes of absolute stillness. This boy is different. His eyes are open wider than necessary. His jaw is set in a way that suggests clenching rather than composure. The corners of his mouth pull downward, not in sadness but in something closer to fear. His posture is too perfect, too rigid, as if he is holding himself in place through sheer force of will. For decades, no one noticed. The photograph was just another artifact of a time when childhood looked different, when discipline was harsh and smiles were rare in portraits. But in 2017, a graduate student studying Victorian-era schooling practices began examining the image more closely. She was interested in clothing, in the differences between wealthy and poor students, in the way social class revealed itself in fabric and tailoring. She scanned the photograph at high resolution and began zooming in on individual faces. When she reached the boy in the second row, she stopped. Something was wrong. She could not name it immediately, could not articulate what her instincts were registering, but she knew that what she was seeing did not match what should have been there. Over the following weeks, the photograph was subjected to digital enhancement and analysis. Contrast was adjusted. Shadows were lifted. Details that had been invisible to the naked eye began to emerge. The boy's expression became clearer. The tension in his face was not the result of long exposure or discomfort. It was something else, something deliberate and sustained. His eyes were not looking at the camera. They were looking slightly to the left, toward the teacher standing at the edge of the frame. Other children in the photograph showed the same general direction of gaze, the natural result of a teacher giving instructions before the picture was taken. But this boy's eyes held a different quality. They were not simply attentive. They were watchful, the way prey watches a predator. His shoulders were drawn up, slightly higher than the children on either side of him. His hands, resting on his knees, showed tension in the tendons, visible even through the limitations of 19th century photography. Experts in historical photography were consulted. They explained that exposure times in 1899 required subjects to remain still for anywhere from 15 to 30 seconds. Any movement would result in blur. Children were often instructed to hold their breath, to fix their eyes on a single point, to imagine themselves as statues. Discomfort was expected. But this level of tension, this visible strain, suggested something beyond the ordinary difficulties of sitting for a portrait. One analyst noted that the boy appeared to be in pain, not physical pain necessarily, but psychological distress. Another observed that his posture resembled that of someone trying to make themselves smaller, to take up less space, to avoid drawing attention. The more the photograph was studied, the more it contradicted the innocence that school portraits were meant to represent. The investigation shifted to identifying the children in the photograph. Local historical records were consulted. School enrollment logs from 1899 were retrieved from the county archives, handwritten ledgers that listed names, ages, and attendance records. The school in the photograph was identified as Millbrook Grammar School, a single-room building that served children from grades 1 through 8. The teacher's name was Miss Evelyn Hargrove, a woman who had taught at the school for nearly 15 years. Census records from 1900 provided additional names, matching children in the photograph to families in the surrounding area. One by one, the faces were identified. Mary Thornton, age 9, daughter of a wheat farmer. Joseph Kellerman, age 7, son of the town blacksmith. Elizabeth Morse, age 11, the eldest of 6 children. The process was slow but methodical. By cross-referencing the school ledger with the photograph, researchers were able to name 22 of the 23 children. But one name was missing. The boy in the second row, fourth from the left, did not appear in any official record. His name was not listed in the enrollment log. He was not accounted for in the attendance sheets. No family in the 1900 census claimed a child matching his age and appearance. It was as if he had been present for the photograph but absent from every other document that should have recorded his existence. This absence became the turning point in the investigation. Children did not simply disappear from records without reason. Enrollment was mandatory. Families were documented. Even in cases of death, records existed, certificates and burial logs and parish registers. But this boy had none of those traces. His presence in the photograph was the only evidence that he had existed at all. To understand the boy's expression, it became necessary to understand what school was like in 1899, particularly in rural Pennsylvania. Education was not the gentle, nurturing environment that modern sensibilities imagine. Discipline was harsh, swift, and often violent. Teachers were granted absolute authority over their students, and corporal punishment was not only accepted but expected. Rullers were used to strike the palms of children who spoke out of turn. Dunce caps were placed on the heads of slow learners, who were then made to stand in corners for hours. Children who misbehaved were sometimes locked in dark storage closets or forced to kneel on hard floors while holding heavy books above their heads. These practices were considered normal, necessary for the formation of character and respect for authority. Diaries from the era describe school as a place of fear as much as learning. A diary entry from a former student of Millbrook Grammar School, written in 1903, describes Miss Hargrove as a woman who demanded absolute silence and obedience. Any infraction, no matter how minor, was met with punishment. The entry describes a boy who was made to stand outside in the cold for an entire afternoon because he had dropped his slate and caused a noise. Another entry mentions a girl who was struck so hard across the knuckles that her hands swelled and she could not write for days. These accounts were not unusual. They reflected a broader cultural belief that children needed to be broken of their natural tendencies toward laziness and disobedience. But even within this context, Miss Hargrove's reputation stood out. Former students who were interviewed decades later described her not just as strict, but as cruel. One woman, interviewed in 1967, remembered being terrified of Miss Hargrove, so frightened that she would sometimes pretend to be ill to avoid school. Another recalled that children who cried after being punished were punished again for showing weakness. The teacher's authority was absolute, and in a small town where reputation mattered more than truth, complaints were rarely taken seriously. Parents trusted teachers. Schools were respected institutions. If a child came home with bruises, it was assumed they had deserved them. When the photograph was examined under extreme magnification, a detail emerged that no one had anticipated. Around the boy's wrists, barely visible beneath the cuffs of his jacket, were faint lines that suggested pressure and restraint. The lines were too straight, too uniform to be accidental. They matched the pattern of something thin and tight, something that had been wrapped around his wrists and then removed shortly before the photograph was taken. A forensic expert specializing in historical image analysis confirmed that the marks were consistent with ligature restraint. The boy had been tied, recently enough that the impressions had not yet faded from his skin. This discovery reframed the entire photograph. It was no longer simply a portrait of uncomfortable children sitting through a long exposure. It was a document of something darker, something that had been hidden in plain sight for over a century. The boy's expression, his rigid posture, his watchful eyes, all of it made sense in the context of restraint and fear. He was not simply uncomfortable. He was terrified, and whoever had tied his wrists had done so shortly before placing him in front of the camera. The question became unavoidable. Why would a child be restrained before a school portrait? What had he done or what had been done to him that required such measures? The photograph offered no answers, only the evidence of the marks themselves and the boy's expression, frozen in a moment that should have been routine but was clearly anything but. Attention turned to Miss Evelyn Hargrove. Her life was documented in scattered records, newspaper mentions, and the few personal letters that had survived. She was born in 1856, the daughter of a minister, raised in a household that valued discipline and obedience above affection. She never married. She lived alone in a small house near the school. Her days were structured around teaching, church attendance, and maintaining her reputation as a woman of moral uprightness. But beneath that surface, there were cracks. In 1902, 3 years after the photograph was taken, a complaint was filed against her by a parent whose daughter had been struck so hard that she suffered a broken finger. The complaint was dismissed. The school board sided with Miss Hargrove, stating that the punishment had been justified and that the parent was overreacting. In 1905, another incident occurred. A boy was found unconscious outside the school, having collapsed after being forced to stand in the sun without water for several hours as punishment for tardiness. Again, no action was taken. Miss Hargrove continued teaching until 1911, when she resigned abruptly and left the town. No reason was given. She moved to Philadelphia and lived there until her death in 1923. Her obituary described her as a dedicated educator who had devoted her life to the betterment of children. There was no mention of the complaints, the incidents, the children who had been harmed under her supervision. But in the memories of those who had been her students, a different story persisted. A story of a woman who used her authority not to teach but to control, to punish, to exert power over those who had no ability to resist. The boy in the photograph, the boy with no name in the records, fit the pattern. He had been at her mercy, and that mercy had been absent. The final piece of the investigation came from census records. The 1900 census, taken just months after the photograph was made, listed every resident of the town. Families were documented, children were named, ages were recorded. Researchers cross-referenced the names from the school ledger with the census, tracking each child into adulthood to see what had become of them. Most had grown up, married, and had families of their own. Some had moved away. A few had died young from illness or accident, their deaths recorded in local burial registers. But the boy in the photograph did not appear in any subsequent census. He was not listed as a resident of the town in 1900. He did not appear in the 1910 census or any census after that. His name, which had been absent from the school records, was also absent from every other document that should have tracked his life. The only explanation was that he had died sometime between the taking of the photograph in the fall of 1899 and the census enumeration in the summer of 1900. But there was no death certificate, no burial record, no mention in the local newspaper of a child's death. He had simply vanished, not just from the records but from the collective memory of the town. The photograph became the only evidence that he had existed at all, the only proof that he had stood in that second row, fourth from the left, with fear in his eyes and marks on his wrists. The image that had seemed so ordinary, so typical of its time, was revealed to be something else entirely. It was a memorial, not by design but by accident, preserving the face of a boy who had been erased from history. The photograph now resides in a different archive, one that specializes in the preservation of historical evidence rather than simple documentation. It is studied by historians, by forensic analysts, by those who work to uncover the hidden truths that official records sometimes fail to preserve. The boy's identity remains unknown. No name has been found. No family has come forward. No records have surfaced to fill in the gaps. But his face is known now. His expression is understood. The fear that he carried in that moment has been acknowledged, more than a century too late. Modern discussions of the photograph often focus on the ethics of such discoveries, the responsibilities that come with revisiting old images and finding suffering where none was previously recognized. There are those who argue that the past should be left undisturbed, that dragging up old tragedies serves no purpose. But others counter that photographs are witnesses, silent and unintentional, but witnesses nonetheless. They capture what was real, even when that reality is uncomfortable or painful. The boy in the 1899 school portrait did not choose to be photographed. He likely did not want to be there at all. But he was placed in that row, in that position, and the camera captured something that words and official records did not. It captured the truth of his experience, the fear that he lived with, the harm that was being done to him. That truth deserves recognition, not because it is pleasant or comforting, but because it is real. The photograph no longer appears normal. Once the details are seen, once the context is understood, it becomes impossible to look at the image and see anything other than what it truly is. Not a simple school portrait, but evidence of injustice, a frozen moment that reveals what authority and silence can do to those who have no power to resist. The boy's name is lost. His story is incomplete. But his face remains, preserved in silver and paper, asking to be seen, demanding to be remembered.